Chapter 12. I am Ali Nazir. Another few weeks dragged on. Now, without the Quran, X and his cellmate were forced to converse even more. The nightly tales became more vividly detailed and intricately embroidered, to the point that X almost convinced himself he really had been raised with love in the lap of luxury. They also conversed about their current lives and, inevitably, women. X had a girlfriend in the small town in Afghanistan where he'd been born, a neighbor's daughter who'd been promised to him at birth. "I have composed a poem for her. Would you like to read it?" "Read it to me," X said. The teen took a sheet of paper from under his mattress, cleared his throat, and began, "Your voice is like a babbling brook, sweet and gentle. When you speak, I hear the harps of angels." He was praising her voice, X realized, because in all likelihood the girl was veiled, and the teen had never actually seen her face. Still, it was touching. Hard to keep in mind that the boy was a stone killer who would murder him in a New York minute if he knew his true identity. X could not share with the boy the names of the many American women he had bedded. Nor could he say he'd slept with them, of course. Intercourse outside marriage was contrary to Islam. The call girls, the barmaids, the grifters, the occasional housewife who pegged him for a con artist and jumped his bones nevertheless because she found it exciting. So he talked about Ali Nazir's third and youngest wife, Jasmine. She was the upstanding daughter of an imam, according to the backstory he concocted, a woman who was wise, virtuous, and obedient. "If I told her to put her hand in fire, she would do it without question," X said, and the boy nodded reverently. One night, before they went to sleep, Asar announced that he had something to say. "Your friendship has meant so much to me," the teen said solemnly. "I thank Allah for bringing you into my life." X hated to admit it, but he felt the same way, except for the Allah part. He didn't know how he would survive the cruelty and monotony of this place without the relentlessly cheerful and optimistic young man. It was puzzling because he'd never felt the need for company before. Never. "It is written, without companionship, even paradise would be boring," he told Asar. In preparation for his role as Ali Nazir, he had boned up on Middle Eastern culture by perusing a list of Arab proverbs he'd found on the internet. It was coming in handy. It was not only with Asar that X had forged a bond. Now a hero to his fellow prisoners, he was surrounded by followers who hung on his every word. They told him stories of their suffering in wars and mistreatment by their captors. They asked for his help in settling disputes. They sought his advice about how to deal with problems at home. Pushing mother-in-laws, rebellious sons. One asked him how to handle a black sheep cousin who refused to do his manly duty and volunteered to be a suicide bomber. He was not an employed ne'er-do-well who could, in the frustrated prisoner's view, at least do that much for the family name. "In time, Allah will speak to him, and he will do the right thing," X replied sagely. "Only he can choose his destiny." X tried, as in that case, to affect Solomon-like wisdom, while actually saying next to nothing. Usually he borrowed from that indispensable list of aphorisms, plagiarized fortune cookies, or adapted quotes from kung fu movies. The only area he stayed clear of was religious matters. Men debating finer points of the Quran would come to him for his opinion, and he would modestly say that they should turn to someone more qualified to resolve the argument, because he was no expert. Putting it mildly, since the only thing he knew about the Quran were the verses he and Asar had read to each other, and the dubious contentions of a former partner who'd gone straight in the joint and joined the Nation of Islam. As his legions of followers grew in number, X began to feel a sense of pride at their high regard. Holding court under the blazing sun, he would momentarily forget he was not Ali Nazir, the heroic defender of Islam. His beard had come in, and he looked the part as well. One morning he was strolling about the exercise yard when a dark, skinny Egyptian named Amir clapped him on the back. "Everyone in the prison has heard how you stood up to the Americans, and word has spread to the outside world as well," Amir informed him. "We are all so proud of you. We know you will not let us down, or Muslim people around the world down." X looked at him quizzically, and Amir leaned in. "They say you are to be interrogated again today," he whispered conspiratorially. "The real deal. A torturer brought in from Iraq. A true sadist who used to work for Alam al-Qas, Saddam's secret police. The word is that, in his hands, a man either breaks or dies." And Amir was just warming up. He's a European. Some say he was trained by the KGB in the art of pain. They call him the Monster. X was screwed, and he knew it, because this time his tormentors would not stop until they got the information out of him. And he didn't know anything, which meant there was a real possibility he would be tortured to death. Sure enough, 2 hours later, X hung upside down from his ankles, looking like a crucified inverted Jesus in a dimly lit, barren room. Now, this time, at least, he wasn't naked. He'd been allowed to keep those overtight jockey shorts. Nevertheless, it was freezing, and he shivered as he hung, waiting interminably. He was determined to give this torturer extraordinaire nothing, to spit in his face. "I am Ali Nazir, leader of the Jihadist Brotherhood. I fear nothing but Allah," he told himself. The real Ali Nazir would not cry or buckle, and neither would he. He said it again and again, a mantra. The door opened, and a fat man entered, his face shrouded in darkness. He was wheeling a cart which squeaked unnervingly. The cart entered a pool of light, and X saw that it was loaded with the implements of torture. Some were recognizable as relics of the Spanish Inquisition, others more modern, like pliers, an adjustable wrench, dental tools, and a cattle prod. It was like some sort of dessert cart from hell. This master torturer must have passed the cell block, giving other detainees food for thought about what they, too, would face. This went far beyond waterboarding, delicately described as a harsh interrogation technique by the American press. X had heard tales from other prisoners of torturers breaking chemical lights and pouring the phosphoric liquid on detainees, splashing ice-cold water on naked prisoners, beating detainees with a broom handle and a chair, sodomizing a prisoner with a chemical light 5 times, and then a plunger for a change of pace. And, sure enough, among the items on display on the table was a foot-long, studded dildo that looked like it was designed to satisfy a mare. "That's going in me," X realized. "I'm going to be raped with it." The monster picked something up from the table. X couldn't see which of the items it was, but he lost it. To hell with the goddamn Jihadist Brotherhood. "Look, please, I'm not Nazir," he jabbered in Arabic. "This is all a mistake. Please, 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 you've got to listen to me. Please, I'll do anything. Just stop. Please, just wait." The man put a finger to his lips and pressed a button on the object in his hand. A recording of high-pitched screams erupted from it. X would have perhaps preferred a manlier yell as an imitation of his cries, but under the circumstances he was relieved that the sounds weren't coming from his own mouth. The man stepped into the light, and X, even upside down, eyes blurry from tears, recognized him at once. He was the pipe-smoking Santa Claus from the Giza Hotel and Casino, Mr. Jones. "Who are you?" he asked hoarsely, daring to speak in English now for the first time in weeks. "You can keep calling me Mr. Jones," the man said. "I suppose the million-dollar question is, who are you?" It took a moment for the import of the question to sink in, and now, for the first time in more than a decade, X uttered his real name. "Oh, yes. Born in Washington, D.C., Mr. Jones said. He proceeded to rattle off the identity thief's name and exact time of birth, his mother's name, his mother's maiden name, his social security number, his home address dating back 7 years, and a litany of other personal details, as he unstrapped X and gently lowered him to the ground. The guy's done his homework. He would make a Class A identity thief, X thought. I wonder what role your mother's suicide played in the formation of your pathology, Mr. Jones pondered aloud. For a man considered a cipher by even his closest associates, it was as if X had suddenly become transparent. Although Mr. Jones gave him back his numbered orange jumpsuit, X felt more naked than he had ever been before in his life. You know who I am? X gasped. For how long? Since you checked into the Giza. You gotta be kidding me. We knew you couldn't be Ali Nazir, because this is Ali Nazir. Mr. Jones handed X an 8x10 photograph showing a man who looked eerily like himself, lying on a slab, a half-circle of bloody bullet holes in his chest. 2 dots in the right place, and he'd have a smiley face. He was killed in a raid in Pakistan 8 weeks ago, not long before you decided to step into his shoes. X shook with righteous indignation. You bastards have let me be hunted like an animal and tortured knowing that I'm innocent? Well, innocent may not be exactly the right word, now is it, young fellow? Mr. Jones said, lighting a pipe. X could only respond with a hostile glare. Personally, I have no respect for identity thieves, Mr. Jones said. A fellow who has the testicular fortitude to knock over a bank with a .357 Magnum in his hands, yes, but you, stealing from old ladies, taking the names of dead babies. Not exactly the stuff that would make you a folk hero like Dillinger. You seem to be treated as a folk hero by your peers, though, Mr. Nazir. X wasn't in the mood to be lectured. What's this all about? What do you want? We need you to infiltrate the stronghold of the chief, as his ally, Ali Nazir. X guffawed so loudly that pain shot through his ribs. He wasn't one to follow international affairs, but he'd seen enough of cable news in passing and heard enough reverent jabber from Asar to know who the chief was. The head of the Warriors of Allah, and Grand Wizard of the loosely organized alliance of terrorist outfits to which the Jihadist Brotherhood belonged. He was a mastermind who, it had been learned in recent years, was the boss of Osama bin Laden and a rogues gallery of other terrorist bigwigs. So all that rough stuff in front of the prisoners, he asked. I shrayed. You're a hero to them now. There's no question about your loyalty, your dedication to the cause, your courage, your piety. X shook his head. Not interested. Interested or not, that's exactly what you're going to do. So I have no choice? Certainly you have a choice. Play ball, or get shot attempting to escape. I'm an American citizen. I have rights. You're a man who doesn't exist. You've gone to such length to erase your true identity that if you disappear off the face of this earth, no one will miss you. X knew this to be true. Let's say I go along with this harebrained scheme of yours. What do I get out of it, other than, of course, not being shot in the back? A full presidential pardon. The 50 or so counts of grand larceny the Attorney General has on his desk just go away. As a cherry on top, your charming girlfriend, Samantha Adamson, will also be pardoned. The authorities are hot on her tail, you know. X hadn't thought of Samantha in weeks, he realized with some shame, a rare emotion for him. He needn't have lost any sleep over this. As it happened, his partner in crime had made it to Brazil, where she took up with a soccer player. Because the jock was a fitness freak and twisted her arm into jogging, she'd even lost weight and was now a size 2. X sighed with resignation. What am I supposed to do? Kill the chief? I'm no assassin. No, you're going to do what you do best. Rob him blind. Chapter 13. The Secret Committee. The organization to which Mr. Jones belongs has a storied past, though it's a story few will ever hear. Originally known as the Committee of Secret Correspondence, it dates back to the American Revolution, when it was helmed by none other than our versatile founding father, Ben Franklin. Under its auspices, Franklin established a secret navy that distributed gunpowder and supplies to pirates paid to disrupt the British Navy. He coordinated the activities of secret agents, gathered information on enemy war plans, and secured clandestine funding from nations that were ostensibly friends of England. These field agents were equipped, a la TV's Wild Wild West, with nifty gadgets of Franklin's own design, such as a boot with a hidden compartment storing lockpicks that could defeat even the most skillfully designed locks of the time, and an opiate strong enough to make the user immune to torture. The author of Poor Richard's Almanac also concocted misinformation and propaganda distributed by committee operatives. The fearsome Hessian mercenaries fighting for the Redcoats had become a growing menace to the Continental Army. Ben forged a letter from a German prince to the commander of his mercenaries, ordering the officer to leave his wounded for dead, rather than have them unfit to serve their prince. The committee also saw that a bogus news article detailing the horrible deaths of Hessian soldiers at the hands of the American Indians found its way to their homeland. Thanks to the campaign of lies, the demoralized Hessians soon withdrew from the war. Most of the papers from this time were so sensitive that they were destroyed. Officially, the committee was disbanded soon after the British surrender, but in fact it continued its work secretly, often in concert with America's greatest Revolutionary War ally, France. During the War of 1812, the committee joined forces with agents of Napoleon to engineer the U.S. invasion of Canada and to undermine the relationship between Britain and Indian tribes. In the First World War, committee operatives worked hand in glove with the French Foreign Legion to defeat the Turks and Germans in North Africa. In the early years of World War II, when the United States was officially neutral and long before the OSS got into the act, the committee teamed up with the French resistance. The secret partnership also came into play, with varying degrees of success in trouble spots like Vietnam, where committee spies aided the Frenchies in their fight against the Communists long before America's official foray into the war. In Haiti, French and American spies joined forces to quietly dispatch a dictator without bloodshed. It should be noted that the committee's efforts were unknown to the CIA, the Secretary of State, and even to the President himself. Funding came not from Congress, but from monies raised from various enterprises, those notorious pirates in the early days, and even more unsavory characters in the present. The upside of this is that not a single dollar of U.S. taxpayers' money went toward the committee's work. None of this did Mr. Jones share with X. He told him only that the committee was so secretive that only 2 other people in the prison were aware of the mission. "How are we even supposed to find the chief?" X demanded. "The CIA, the Marines, everyone else has been hunting for him for years." "Ah, well, that's where your young cellmate comes in." "Assar? The chief's driver? The only man in U.S. custody who knows the chief's whereabouts. It's no accident you were placed in his cell and given the opportunity to earn his trust." "So the plan is, you and he escape from jail, and he leads you to the chief's hiding place. We fake a jailbreak. No, you're going to really escape, as I said, other than 2 people in this prison under my command. No one knows you're working for the committee. Not the colonel in charge, not the Marines, not the CIA interrogators." "Well, I'm clearly not as gifted a planner as you, but wouldn't it be easier to tell them?" Mr. Jones shook his head. "Unfortunately, the prison is lousy with moles. Warrior of Allah moles. X found that hard to swallow. What, posing as Marine guards, as janitors and cooks? The Warriors of Allah has been putting people in place, deep cover operatives, for years, long before 9/11. They're masters at creating false identities. Gee, you can't trust anyone these days. Mr. Jones seemed genuinely amused by that. His blue eyes twinkled. He drew a paper out of his vest pocket and handed it to the identity thief. Here are the plans. Read them, memorize them, then I'm afraid I'm going to have to destroy them. X perused the plans, trying to ignore the increasingly loud and frequent screams emanating from the digital recorder. They were to crawl through a narrow ventilation shaft from the isolated ward of the prison hospital, out onto a rooftop, run across it without being seen, and drop through a hatch into a building that housed equipment being used to remodel what had once been the old commandant's quarters, turning it into a chapel. There they were to borrow tools and use them to dig a 16-foot tunnel under the prison fence. "You gotta be joking," X protested. 16 feet? How long is that supposed to take? "According to our calculations, 3 weeks, working nightly. You'll have proper tools, remember, not sharpened spoons." "Nightly? You mean we're supposed to make that trip through the air shaft, like Mission Impossible, and then over the rooftop every night for nearly a month, without being spotted?" "Precisely," said Mr. Jones, pointing his pipe at X for emphasis. All X knew about prison breaks was what he'd seen in old World War II movies like The Great Escape. Perhaps if he were humble enough to believe he'd ever be pinched, he would have read up on the subject. This didn't sound particularly feasible. But he saw a bigger problem, and he brought it to Mr. Jones' attention. "How are we supposed to get into the infirmary?" he demanded. Mr. Jones gave a smile that made X uneasy. "Ah, yes, how indeed," he said. "This is the really creative part of the plan, the part an ingenious mind like yours is sure to appreciate." He took from the cart a black plastic container about the size of an eyeglass case. He opened it, revealing a hypodermic needle. "What the fuck is that?" X demanded. The bearded man held up a needle and grinned. "Yersinia pestis," he revealed, "also known as Pasteurella pestis, a.k.a. plague bacillus." X shook his head in disbelief. "As in the bubonic plague?" Mr. Jones nodded, still wearing the benign smile. X stepped back, folding his arms. "You expect me to let you inject me with black plague germs? If that's your plan, you'd better just hang me back on those chains. I'd be better off. In fact, I'll hook myself up." The spy master chuckled. "As a genetically engineered variety, our lab boys cooked up. We call them the Ben Franklin Department. Don't ask me to explain the science of it, but in a nutshell, you'll have all the symptoms of the plague, and your blood will test positive for it. But the bug is designed to die out after 72 hours. After that, your temperature will continue to run high for a few weeks, but you'll be fit as a fiddle. You'll have to fake feeling too weak to move. Make-believe is your strong suit, isn't it?" X was picturing Black Death bacterium swimming like salmon through his bloodstream, and continued to shake his head. No, he kept muttering. "You'll infect your cellmate, and you'll both begin to experience the symptoms. Swollen lymph glands in your armpits, groin and neck, chills, fever. You'll vomit up blood fairly continuously for a while, and then there'll be blood in your piss as well. You'll cough a good bit, and most dramatically, little black dots will appear all over your body. You'll suffer some real delirium, although, as I said, after a few days you'll have to go on faking that in front of the medical staff." X's distrust of Mr. Jones was quickly blossoming into hatred. The old man delivered this news with obvious relish. "I suppose it'd be too simple to just give us the flu." the identity thief said without any attempt to disguise his bitterness. Mr. Jones opened a bottle of alcohol and dipped a cotton ball in it. "We need something that will get you into the special isolation room and keep you there. For obvious reasons, the room has its own ventilation, and the shaft leads to precisely where you need to be." He stepped toward X, with the needle in one hand and the cotton swab in the other. X stepped back. "Now, don't be a baby," Mr. Jones said. "You know there's no alternative. It's either this or I leave you to the CIA interrogators. You'll be tortured, subjected to harsh interrogation techniques for weeks or months, given rougher and rougher treatment because you refuse to break, since, of course, you have nothing to give them. Then, your mind and body broken, you'll be deep-sixed and forgotten in some holding center until the war on terror is over, a few decades from now. Or you somehow manage to convince someone of who you really are, in which case you go to prison stateside until we have flying cars." X stared at the rotund, white-bearded man, trying to make his Santa-like appearance jibe with his heartless words. "You make a compelling case," he said finally, raising his arm. No, Mr. Jones said, pushing down his arm. "Not there." X smirked and turned around. "In the butt? Why am I not surprised? How appropriate." "Bottom of your feet, between your toes, if you don't mind," the elderly spook said. "I'm afraid you'll be searched before the symptoms kick in, and we can't have any obvious marks on you." X sighed and lifted up his right foot, like a horse being shod. Chapter 14. Welcome to the Team. Mr. Jones, whose real name was Arnold Fiorella, by the way, didn't always want to be a spy. Indeed, he attended divinity school with every intention of being ordained a priest. But during the 70s, when the intelligence community was ravaged by the corrupt influence of politicians all the way up to the White House, he saw the need to restore American spies to the role they'd played in World War II. Back then, the OSS matched wits with Hitler's spy masters, and secret agents were knights without armor, championing the cause of liberty. So he joined the CIA, and within a year was recruited by the committee. Mr. Jones still considered his current calling God's work. When the second President Bush was chided for using the incendiary word crusade to describe the war on Islamofascism, Mr. Jones solemnly told his colleagues the Commander-in-Chief was right the first time. "This is a holy war, make no mistake about it," he said in the musty, mahogany-paneled meeting hall in Philadelphia, where committee chiefs had gathered since the Revolution. "A clash of civilizations doesn't begin to cover it. This is good versus evil." Mr. Jones was a vastly talented spy master. He was especially adept at black flag recruitments, convincing people to surrender their country's secrets to what they believed was a friendly nation. How many Jewish intelligence officers in Argentina had he flipped into double agents by convincing them their handler was Israeli? Despite his rather broad puritanical streak, he made liberal use of ladies, as they were called, to lure officials into compromising situations. Photographs of such honey traps provided Jones with biographic leverage, known to the uninitiated as blackmail material, to control the subject. Mr. Jones pulled the strings of such hapless souls so deftly that his nickname on the committee became the Puppet Master, and later Geppetto. Back in his cell, wearing a few obligatory bruises the spy master had apologetically applied to his cheek, eyebrow, and lower lip, X lay on his bunk. Though he'd feigned a limp when lurching into the cell, there was nothing fake about his mental exhaustion. His eyes were shut, and he said nothing, but his cellmate didn't take the hint. Asar rambled on effusively. "I knew they couldn't break you. Those infidels know nothing about the strength of spirit Allah confers on his warriors, those who have surrendered to him." "You bet," X said in English. Asar laughed heartily. "I know what that means. I heard it in a Tom Cruise movie." X rolled over on his belly. Was he already beginning to feel ill? Or was it his imagination? Surely the microbes couldn't work that fast. Or could the genetically engineered medical miracles do anything their creators wanted? "I cannot wait until they come for me," Asar declared, thumping his chest. "I will spit in their faces, just as you have done. You are my inspiration, Ali. It is an honor to share the company of one such as you." FBI agent Tracy Kingsmith walked across the prison yard, escorted by a pair of Marines, uncomfortably aware of the stares of prisoners in orange jumpsuits milling around the exercise yard. It was obvious they hadn't seen a woman in a long time, certainly not one without a burqa. "Jesus, is there no prohibition against undressing a woman with your eyes in your culture?" she thought. Why she'd been excused from her duties in the middle of her lunch break by her boss, Mr. Normand, and flown halfway around the world she could not imagine. She'd simply been told that it was a matter of national security, and she was to pack only necessities. Until she boarded the small jet, the Cessna 560 Citation 5, she was not even told by the pilot where they were bound. He and the co-pilot were the only other souls on board, and they didn't utter a single word to her except to tell her to buckle her seatbelt before takeoff and unbuckle it after landing. Now, with her escorts, she strode toward a drab, windowless, flat-roofed cinder-block building in the center of Abd al-Rahman Prison in Afghanistan. It was one of a dozen squat buildings surrounded by a double line of 12-foot-high chain-link fences. Each fence was topped with rusted razor wire. There were 4 guard towers, one at each corner of the compound. Machine-gun muzzles protruded from the covered platforms. She and her silent escorts approached the 2-story building, the only one with windows, albeit tiny ones. 2 Marine guards toting M4 carbine assault rifles stood on either side of a metal door. A hand-painted sign above the entrance identified this as the administration building. After Tracy's escort gave one of the guards her papers, he pushed a button on the right side of the door, and a buzzer sounded so loudly she almost jumped. The door swung open, and they were admitted. They marched down a long, sterile hall lined with closed doors. Then the agent was ushered into a small room that, suspiciously, had nothing but the word "office" on the plaque beside it. When Tracy saw Mr. Jones behind the desk, she was not bewildered. More pissed off, really. "I might have known you had something to do with this," she snapped. "What agency do you work for?" Mr. Jones lit his pipe. "Have a seat." Tracy didn't move. "Are you going to answer my question?" He smiled enigmatically. "Then I'm out of here," she declared and turned. "The only thing I'm at liberty to say is that I have the authority to have you shot before you set foot outside the gates." He said it calmly and without overt menace, but with enough iron in his tone to leave her no doubt whatsoever that he was speaking the truth. She turned slowly. He gestured to the chair, and she sat, her ankles crossed in a ladylike manner, with her hands in her lap. "Congratulations on your capture in Nevada," he said. "Very impressive." "Thank you," she replied icily. "I should tell you, however, that the man you took into custody is not Ali Nazir." "The hell he isn't." And so Mr. Jones told her of Nazir's death, of X's true identity, of the mission, and with every fresh revelation she shook her head with incredulity. "Why wasn't I informed that the man we spent hundreds of man-hours and millions of dollars pursuing was a fake?" she said. "A 2-bit hustler." "No one in the FBI was informed, nor in the Department of Homeland Security." "You've got to be joking. We were all on a wild goose chase? Why weren't we in the loop?" "There are plants in all of those agencies. Muslim Americans, and perhaps even some non-Muslims, who are deep-cover operatives of the Warriors of Allah." "And the CIA? Homeland Security? Come on." You probably know that 9/11 caught our nation with its pants down. Our intelligence agency had only a handful of Arabic-speaking agents, and we had to go on a recruiting spree. Well, while we were busy catching up, our enemies were busy planting moles. In fact, they planted many of their moles years before the attack. Okay, that makes a crazy kind of sense, she thought. Well, wouldn't it be more prudent to use one of our own agents? Why would you want to use an untrained, unscrupulous, to put it mildly, civilian on a sensitive mission like this? As I've said, the U.S. intelligence community is riddled with moles, and how many CIA agents just happen to be dead ringers for Ali Nazir? When this Ali Nazir suddenly surfaced a few weeks after the real one was eliminated, well, it presented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, particularly since, of course, he's a totally deniable, not to mention disposable, asset. What's my role supposed to be? You'll be Nazir's handler. You know how he thinks better than anyone. I thought he was Ali Nazir until 5 minutes ago. Mr. Jones smiled. You captured him. You outthought him. There's every chance this con artist will bolt the first chance he gets. You have to prevent that. Tracy's role would be to accompany Ali Nazir, Asar, and a third man, whose identity had not yet been revealed to her, after their escape, to the mountains where it was believed the chief's lair lay. Her cover was to be a member of the jihadist movement. But my Arabic, she protested, my accent is far from perfect. Your cover is that you're a librarian, explained Mr. Jones. Their official language is English, so your accent will be perfectly fine unless you run into Henry Higgins. You're also familiar with Pashto and Dari, correct? Enough to do some translations for the Bureau, but that's all we need. Mr. Jones raised a hand, silencing her. Now, I want you to meet someone. He pressed an intercom button. Send in the prisoner. The door opened, and a Marine shoved in a bearded man in handcuffs and leg irons. For a moment she thought it was X in eyeglasses. He had a similar small, wiry frame and swarthy complexion, but on closer inspection she realized it was a stranger. Harry Assad, meet Special Agent Tracy King, Mr. Jones said. Excuse me for not shaking hands, the man said with a little smirk that made Tracy decide right off the bat she didn't like him. Mr. Jones explained, He's been planted among the inmates under the name Muammar el-Shabazz. He'll be moved in with Ali Nazir today. Your Saudi intelligence? Tracy suggested. Harry's a Lebanese-American in the Defense Intelligence Agency, Mr. Jones informed her, and, like you, now working for the committee. How do we know he's not a mole? She said sarcastically. A Muslim fanatic. I happen to be a Christian, Harry responded with obvious irritation. Well, that's a relief. Hallelujah. Have a seat, Harry, Mr. Jones said with a courteous smile, gesturing to a seat beside Tracy. Harry's a computer whiz. He graduated first in his class at MIT, made $20 million creating computer games. Well, that'll come in handy if we run into an army of zombies, she said, using her fingers as an imaginary gun to pick off targets. She was liking this less and less. We recruited him in 11th grade, and in exchange for a modest sum of startup capital, he agreed to create programs for us. Some rather nifty ones, I must say, including a virus that's made all of Russia's nuclear missile systems inoperable, and some artificial intelligence stuff that would, well, let's just say it would blow your mind. Tracy shrugged. Mr. Jones opened his mouth to continue his sales pitch, but Harry raised a hand to stay him. I sold my company to Microsoft and retired at 23, he said in a somber voice, but when 9/11 happened, I wanted to do something about it. So I volunteered to be a field agent. Tracy had no snappy comeback to that. Invoking 9/11 was a trump card that had a way of extinguishing debate. Harry is an expert marksman. He can match the best of the CIA farm boys shot for shot, Mr. Jones said. Farm boys was a euphemism in the intelligence agency for assassins, Tracy knew. And he has a black belt like you, Mr. Jones went on. Perhaps you'd like to hold a sparring match sometime. Tracy had no interest in Harry's resume, although kicking someone's ass right now held a certain appeal. She had no doubt she could take the little guy. "So, what's the plan, Mr. Smith?" "Jones." "Of course." The spy master knocked off the friendly host act and got down to business. "After raiding an Islamist safe house in Berlin, our friends at the BND did some routine neutron bombardment to scan captured documents. They uncovered invisible writing pertaining to the chief on pages of a Quran. The BND was Germany's intelligence agency, the Bundesnachrichtendienst. Tracy knew that much. It literally means the Federal News Agency, thus a nickname for their assassins was cub reporters. The chief has amassed a war chest of approximately $45 billion, Mr. Jones went on. We believe he intends to use the money to purchase a weapon of mass destruction from Ukraine. Where the funds are hidden, we don't know." That got Tracy's attention, as talk of nukes generally does with law enforcement officers. "Nuclear material?" "We don't know what it is. Our Ali Nazir and Harry here will penetrate the chief's hideout and execute a computer theft of those funds." "Is this con man a computer nerd, too?" "Leave the technical stuff to me," Harry boasted. "All Ali Nazir has to do is get me to a computer terminal in the chief's headquarters, or near enough to hack in with a laptop. I'll do the rest." "Glad it's going to be such a cakewalk," Tracy said, crossing her arms with a sour expression. "So what's next?" Mr. Jones was beaming again, in full Santa Claus mode. "First we get you some language tapes to brush up on your dialects," he said. "Then we measure you for burqa.